There was definitely a time in the New Zealand art scene where the writing community and the painters, because they were primarily painters and not much else, were really closely aligned, and those painters who did things that the writers could relate to did particularly well, I think it's been said. And it's also probably no coincidence that the writers, poets, those sorts of people tended to become the art critics too, those that wrote about the artists. So there were a range of relationships between those who wrote, those who made art, those who wrote in their art, or used the work of writers in their art. There's also a whole discussion about nationalism in the New Zealand art, the need to establish an identity for which certain artists served a very strong purpose, and that sort of discussion that was also going on in literature. So I think we've moved on from that as a time. I suspect it could have also been to do with the scale of communities, where you have a very defined small community with a handful of artists and writers. Everybody would know everybody. A reviewer like TJ could physically get around every exhibition opening and write about it in the Herald, whereas now I counted a few years ago, more than 100 galleries listed in the phone book, of which a serious critic would want to keep track of at least 30 of them, all opening a new exhibition every month. I think one of the more lively aspects of the Auckland art scene is the artist-run gallery scene, of which there's a couple opening and closing every year, it seems. Sometimes they aren't long-lived affairs, and I don't think they're meant to be anymore. People have become aware of this transient nature of existing, and one of the longer-running ones is Room 103. I always think of it as Room 103, although that's no longer its name and wasn't its name for terribly long. But they seem to embrace the transient nature of those sorts of entities only really being able to exist in the sorts of buildings where the landlord had longer term plans and were only giving it at cheap rent in the short term until they got around to developing it. I think the people behind the various room galleries understood that quite well, and at some point must have acknowledged it if that wasn't the plan from the start. And every time they moved, they would become named after whichever room they were. Art space started off in that sort of mode as well, and through longevity has become an institution that's quite important and needs the sort of support to make it sustainable, because there's a lot of the Auckland infrastructure that now relies on it. It's an important part of the network, I guess, rather than a fleeting part of the network that sort of feeds and nourishes for a short period. But nevertheless started off as an experimental space run by artists outside of institutions without the influence of curators and all those sorts of people like myself. But there's also been other ones like Test Strip as well in the 1990s. And before that, there was a strand of that sort of art making in the 1970s, which quite bizarrely actually happened, of all places, in the Auckland City Art Gallery, as it was then known, the big institution in the country, due to some very receptive staff who happened to be there at the time, who also had a good relationship with the likes of Jim Allen, who was heading Elam's sculpture department in the 1970s. I'm not sure if having such a multifarious kind of structure as we do in Auckland, with so much going on all over the place that's sort of grown and bred in an organic manner, is necessarily an ideal situation either. It's certainly a situation that's the product of its own setting that has happened in response to that. But it may not necessarily be the most efficient way that things could be done. I don't know what is. But it is a very labyrinthine infrastructure for anyone outside the art scene or those new to it. It takes a while to figure out, I'm sure. I guess all that fracturedness is also a symptom of a market-driven economy, that supposedly the market will determine itself, which is one of the great fallacies of the right, and everything else has to make do. And so there's a very make-do infrastructure, a very fragile infrastructure that relies so much on artist-run enterprises, run for love and certainly not for money, that the career path is really determined and reliant on those sorts of self-run initiatives, because the infrastructure isn't there. The market certainly doesn't support that. And I think that whole dealer public gallery system that supports the A-list artists isn't even of interest for a lot of emerging artists. But the other weird thing about the market is it's also impacted on education. So you have a situation where there's something like 6 art schools in Auckland alone, churning out, I don't know how many graduates every year, with bachelor's degrees and master's degrees and doctorates, of whom a very small percentage will have a career as an artist. And so that's kind of feeding into that whole dynamic as well. There's hugely disproportionate, it's not just a pyramid, it does that. And the sea of people who are all set up as artists, and there's no infrastructure to support that. What do? Yeah, they've set up their own spaces and run galleries and do projects for a while and then maybe go on to do something else or go overseas. But the market has, although it doesn't support those galleries, has set up a scenario where those sorts of things are necessary. It's quite a weird and confused sort of situation, I guess.